Order, order. Welcome to this morning's session of the Transport Select Committee. It's our first session of a series of sessions we're going to have on buses connecting communities. We're doing this inquiry because many MPs from all across the country in England and all parties raised with me their concerns about bus services in their area. And in many parts of England outside London and the centre of the major conurbations, bus passenger numbers and bus services are in decline. So many members feel this is a very significant issue. So in this session, we're going to examine the current state of bus services with our first panel. And in our second panel, we're going to cover the impacts on people of poor bus connectivity, particularly in rural and suburban areas. So could I start by asking the first panel of witnesses to introduce themselves?
Good morning, I'm Simon Mathieson, Director of Operational Excellence at First Bus. First Bus is part of First Group, one of the leading transport providers in the UK. We have over 13,000 employees in the UK and our customers have about 1 million daily journeys with us. Thank you.
Excuse me. I'm Bobby Morton, a National Officer for Unite the Union Passenger Transport Sector. Yes, that's it.
Good morning, I'm Ben Simm. I'm Team Manager for Transport Strategy and Policy at Leicestershire County Council. Leicestershire County Council is the local transport authority for bus services and network across the county of Leicestershire, and our bus network equates to 6 million miles, of which 4.8 miles is commercial and 1.2 miles is supported by the council.
Good morning, I'm Andrew Summers. I'm Chief Executive of Transport East. We're the subnational transport body for Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Southend and Thurrock. We're an independent partnership of all 29 local authorities, so 5 local transport authorities and 24 district authorities, and we're the collective view of strategic transport. For the purpose of this inquiry, we're the Rural Centre of Excellence for the East of England, and so heavily interested in rural transport.
Excellent, and thank you very much, all of you, for coming today, and also for your submissions to our evidence. So I'm going to kick off and let you all answer without, if possible, repeating what somebody else has said. How would you describe the current state of bus services in England outside the major cities now in 2025? Simon.
Thank you. I mean, I think we would describe it as a very mixed picture. So we see some really good examples of where bus passengers are benefiting from improved services. I'd point towards Norfolk and Portsmouth in particular, where services have been improved through various funding regimes or local partnership approaches that have worked really well. But equally, we obviously recognise there's a real need for some different answers for other communities who have not had some of those benefits, and services have been reduced or declining for all kinds of reasons, which we might want to explore later. But a very mixed picture, I think we would say.
Yes, you did say the state of things outside of London, and they are in a precarious state at the moment. I actually use public transport quite often, mainly to support my members. We have the largest membership of bus drivers within Unite the Union, and I very often find, particularly at weekends, that it's like a casino game, trying to guess what time that the buses will arrive, and quite often, again, particularly at the weekend, but also on weekdays as well, buses fail to arrive.
From Leicestershire County Council's perspective, it is challenging at the moment. We are a very rural county that's focused around the city of Leicester. The City of Leicester is its own local transport authority, and all our bus routes operate in and out of the city on key radials. The key challenges for us, for our communities, is the cost of buses. The costs obviously can be quite a barrier for their ability to get access to employment, education opportunities and health facilities. But also with rural communities as well, what we're finding is we're unable to necessarily to provide a bus network which caters for them, and if they're unable to drive, that means they're becoming isolated from key facilities, and that's a significant challenge for us as a county council at the moment to enable to do that. And that builds into requirements in terms of, does the bus network go to where people want to go to, and then delivering its reliability in terms of the maintenance and operation of the road network. So there's some of the key challenges we're facing at the moment in terms of that as a county council.
Yeah, and I think in answer to your question about the state, zooming in on the east of England as a case study, a region of 3.5 million people, 1 million of those living in rural areas. In terms of passenger numbers over the last 10 years, I guess there was a peak in 2014, but there's been a 14% reduction on those 2014 levels to now. So overall, over 10 years in the east, a reduction. But over the last year, there has been an increase as well. So 77 million passengers in 2023 compared to 90 million in 2024. And that's reflected as well in vehicle miles. And as one of the other speakers said, there's a variation, I think, across the region. Some of our local authorities have reported services being cut, for example, in Thurrock, or reduced frequencies as well in Suffolk. But where there has been investment, for example, through the BSIP funding in Norfolk, there have been noticeable improvements as a result of that investment, that targeted investment. So a mixed picture for a variety of reasons. The data says, a long-term decline from 2014, but over the last year or so, an increase as a result of some of those factors.
Thank you. So that's where we are now. We've had that, as you've just said, Andrew, a long-term decline of 1 billion passenger journeys since 2009, and since 2021, a 23% cut in services. And I'll ask each of you, starting with Andrew, what do you think is the major cause of those declining trends?
Yeah, so from our local authority's perspective, there's two factors here. There's demand side and supply side. On the demand side, it's very much around the macro environmental factors that are at play here in the wider economy and environment. Just picking out some of the key ones over the last few years in particular, the change in working patterns, for example, hybrid working in the east. 38% of people can now work from home in the Transport East area, and our local authorities are therefore reporting that Mondays and Fridays in particular are challenging for public transport to make ends meet. We're competing against increased car usage as well over that period of time. So when you look at car mileage trends in the east at the same time, pretty much back at 2019 levels pre-COVID as well. So car levels have increased, but the bus levels haven't caught up, and there's a competitive advantage, therefore, that the cars have. I think one of the other major macro factors is the planning system as well, and a lot of our councillors are identifying challenges around building origins and destinations in locations that don't cater for public transport use but favour car use, and the continuation of that over decades has created this environment where it's unprofitable for public transport. So there's a lot of demand-side factors in the macro environment. I think on the supply side as well, real challenges, as others have mentioned, around the financial sustainability of buses. Probably come on to this in later questions, but local authorities have all said that funding uncertainty and the lack of that long-term certainty of investment really does hold back the environment for buses to really flourish going forwards. And I guess the siloed approach to bus investment as well. And one of the things that we as Transport East have always advocated for is integrated settlements for transport, giving local authorities the ability to have a more of a portfolio approach to delivering transport through investment. But the siloed short-term approach of bus funding over the last few years has acted against that. So I guess in summary, demand side and supply side both acting together to create this environment.
Okay.
For us, I think one of the key challenges is the cost, as I've already said. But I think building on reliability in terms of that the bus network for Leicestershire doesn't necessarily go to where people want to go to. So a lot of our communities have to interchange in the middle of Leicester. That makes the journey time much longer compared to car use, and their car use becomes more favoured over that. So I think the work we're doing at Leicestershire County Council is trying to look at where the origin and destination elements are and where do people want to go to try and build a bus network that does that, and looking at hub and spokes, because I think the old way of looking at key radials in and out of urban centres, and that isn't necessarily what people want anymore. And big upon Andrew's comments as well about development has spread out, so we've got a lot of destinations now Foss Park, for example, in Leicestershire, is on the edge of Leicester City, but actually sits in Blaby. In Leicestershire, it sits next to M121. It's a major retail park that serves Leicestershire. It's next to the M1 motorway, M1 Junction 21, which is regularly congested, which then impacts the local road network, and then the buses get caught up in that, which then undermines the reliability of the bus service, which means that then people are delayed, and it adds increased delay. So I think for us, it's in terms of building the bus network being a reliable alternative as a car. I think that's one of the key challenges that we're trying to factor in, as well dealing with developers who approach us by saying, well, we'll provide a public transport offer by amending this bus service. The bus service currently operates potentially on a 30-minute frequency, for example, but that could push it up to 45 minutes or an hour, and then it's meandering around different areas, and therefore isn't serving the purpose that it was originally created for.
Robert, anything to add?
Yes, I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is the shortage of bus drivers.
We'll come. We've got some questions on that, so we'll come on to that.
Okay, sorry, can you repeat the question?
No, that's fine. I'm just, yeah. No, okay, yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
Can we come back to the shortage of the issue of bus drivers later on in the questions?
Yes, I wanted to reply to your question.
Yeah, no, sure. Go on, okay.
But if you can remind me what the question is.
The decline since 2009 and the even quicker decline since 2021, what are the main factors of that decline in services and in passenger numbers?
Well, I've already described the problems that I have as a passenger, and I won't go through them again. But there are other problems as well. You know, the fares that they were increasing hand over fist, if you'll pardon the expression. And it was only when the cap on the fares came in that people returned again as passengers to the bus service. Now, once again, that dropped when the cap became £3. Now, that cap ends in December, and we all wonder what will happen in December. If it goes up again, then there'll be a further dilution of the passengers who are taking the bus to work, and it just won't happen. And that's a major problem as far as we see it.
I would certainly support a lot of what Andrew said, so I wouldn't want to repeat that. I think from our point of view, there's probably two elements I'd add. One is the impact of congestion and just what we've seen in terms of the slowing down of bus services. Every hour we run a bus costs us about £60 an hour. So just looking at it from a pure financial point of view, which we have to do ultimately, you know, every time we try and extend a journey, or it takes 10 minutes longer to get in and out of a place or to a village, we've got to think that every time it's increasing cost by £60 an hour. That's quite a lot of revenue to try and collect in that hour to make up for those costs. So the congestion impact is definitely there. But in Hampshire, for example, we've seen where 25% journey improvement has given a 60% passenger increase in the first year on the Eclipse service between Fareham and Gosport. So it can be done in terms of solving that congestion. I think the other point I'd make, particularly since 2021, is we still haven't seen the full recovery of patronage for concessionary travel. So people have concessionary passes, tend to be the older generation. They were very put off travelling by bus, in particular during COVID, for all kinds of good reasons, and the messaging around that really hit home with them. They haven't returned in the same level of numbers that we've seen non-concession passengers coming back. So I think there's something still to be done about further encouragement for concessionary pass holders to travel on bus and feel that it's a safe thing to do.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a circular link between people having less confidence in buses, reliability, etc. So being marginal car users, going to the car more creates more congestion in places, cities like Leicester. Okay, thank you. Catherine.
Thank you. When asked about the state of bus services, you used words like mixed and precarious, challenging and long-term decline. But the 2021 National Bus Strategy aimed to reverse bus service decline and increase patronage. So how would you judge its success?
I would say mixed again, at the risk of repeating myself. And some of the results haven't necessarily been tied to the most obvious allocations of funding. So we have seen, I don't think Leicester City got anything particularly in terms of BSIP funding, or certainly not in the early tranches, but managed through the partnership approach that ourselves and the other operators in Leicester have had to still provide a more holistic bus network where we've seen patronage growth. But equally, we've seen areas where perhaps some of the funding or the intent didn't quite work or wasn't aimed quite at the right thing. So I think my answer would be mixed. The answer around what could we do better about that going forward is much better, closer working in partnership between operators and local authorities in whatever regulatory model that might be. It's the joint working, the partnership working that will lead to the success.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's difficult not to go into what I said before about the number of drivers. I'll try and skate around that. But the 21 Act was a good act, I thought. The only problem is that it wasn't delivered the way it was supposed to. There are all kinds of different reasons for that. It would take all morning for me to go into the reasons, but if the act had been acted upon the way it was supposed to have been done, then we might not be sitting here today. But the act failed deliberately. As I say, I'm repeating myself now for all kinds of different reasons.
Rather than taking all morning, though, if you had a headline as to why it wasn't delivered in the way it was supposed to, what would you be able to give an indication as to some of the reasons as to why that happened, or what we saw happen?
Well, again, and again, at the risk of repeating myself, there is a massive shortage of bus drivers. And that's not been it's not been taken care of. It's not been addressed whatsoever. And the latest figures that we have is that there are 4,000 bus drivers nationally short in the industry. Now, until that's fixed, we can't say that's collectively the unions and the operators as well. Until that problem is fixed, then we can't negotiate the 21 Act. It's a thing that it will come up constantly, I'm afraid, when I'm talking, because it's something I face every day. Why isn't the bus turning up? And of a Saturday and Sunday where I live, I'm asking myself the same question, and I'm becoming incredibly frustrated when the bus doesn't turn up. And I'm incredibly frustrated because I know why the bus isn't turning up, because there's no driver to drive it to my bus stop.
Thank you.
I think for us as a county council, one of the key challenges we're facing is funding. I think that's well recognised. But in terms of delivering a bus network, really at the moment we're still in a phase of having annual settlements around funding for bus provision. And that enables us to plan for the long term and develop a bus network which actually we can sustain and we can deliver for our communities. If we had multi-year funding settlements, that means we could plan for the long term and make sure that we can deliver bus services that can support our rural communities and that we can deliver them over that time scale. So at the moment, we're working within the BSIP and that strategy, but for us, we need certainty around the funding for us to enable to enact on some of those ambitions and objectives that we have as a county council.
So last year, we as Transport East and our neighbouring subnational transport bodies, so Transport for the South East and England's Economic Heartland, brought together all 30 chairs of enhanced partnerships across the wider South East of England for a day session to tackle the very question that you just asked there. And we reflected on the last couple of years since the introduction of the 21 strategy. There were good and bad issues and lessons learned. In terms of the good things, those areas that did get funding, for example, Norfolk, did see demonstrable increases in patronage and passenger satisfaction. So Norfolk got £50 million roughly of BSIP funding around 2021. As a result of that, they saw an increase of 16% in patronage on those routes. So it worked where the funding worked well. The other thing that our local authorities have said is that it really raised the profile of buses amongst local politicians, and local politicians are fundamental for really driving forward buses in their local areas. It also developed a policy framework and partnerships with operators, which often wasn't there beforehand, which really strengthened that relationship and provided a framework for working together going forwards. In terms of the areas that were, I guess, less well received by our local authorities, the bidding process was seen as very onerous and very painful. Local authorities on average spend about 30k per bid to government when they have to go through these processes. That was seen as a wasted cost if that money could have just been allocated. And 4 out of 5 of our enhanced partnerships didn't receive funding in the first round, so seen as largely a wasted effort on their part. And some of the rules around the application process for BSIPs changed. So the emphasis went from accessibility to then requiring bus priority measures. And that leads to some of the issues around the policy and delivery challenges that don't quite meet. So our local authorities have said they often don't have the capacity and capability in-house to be able to deliver bids quickly. And then some of the demands of the BSIP funding were big capital schemes such as bus priority. They didn't have them ready to go. So when, I guess, the bids were assessed, those that didn't have those bus priority schemes in weren't accepted, despite the fact that they didn't have the capacity and capability in-house to have developed them over the last couple of years. So I think there's some real challenges here that others have pointed out around, good bits of practice. The bidding process didn't work, and supporting the capacity and capability of local authorities going forward is going to be fundamental as we go forward with this process.
Can I ask a two-part follow-up question? Part of the aim of the 2021 strategy was to encourage a move from cars to buses to support net zero goals and improve air quality. Has that shift happened? I think I might know the answer to that. But where would interventions be best focused to encourage modal shift?
So I guess you've got to look at the supply and the demand side. In the east, it's the car dominates really because it's much easier to drive places, the ability to fund bus services. But what we have seen in Norfolk again is where you can improve accessibility by passenger transport. It genuinely does work. I think the key here is an integrated package of measures. So the problem in the past is, this is an example of, this is a siloed approach today looking at buses, but actually this is part of an integrated package that's required across local authorities. The DfT's Integrated National Transport Strategy, which the Secretary of State is pushing forward, I think is a really good way to start to join up the siloed thinking that takes place. I would give an example. Previously, before this, I worked at Transport for London, and one of the really good examples there was the Healthy Streets portfolio that was brought in, that brought together the different funding streams that were modally isolated before into one portfolio package with a long-term funding envelope and clarity on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve there. And I think if we can move towards integration, away from silos based on wider outcomes, I think that would go a long way to tackling this problem.
So for us as Leicestershire County Council, we've actually taken the step and published our new local transport plan 4. So we've written a new local transport plan, and we took that decision to do that before the publication of the local transport plan guidance by the Department for Transport. That's partly because our old local transport plan was coming to the end of its life in 2026, but we've got significant challenges that we need to tackle across Leicestershire, which includes we've got the fastest growing population across the East Midlands, but also across England. We've also got a rapidly ageing population. By 2043, the majority of our population will be aged 65 and over, so we're more reliant upon those bus network and those bus services. As well, we've got to find at least an additional 120,000 homes across the county. That was before the recent announcements in terms of housing delivery from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. So we've got significant challenges to do that. But we see our local transport plan is that the bus is part of one piece of the jigsaw of a bigger solution, and that's multimodal integrated transport. So we've built a policy strategy that sets out our core vision, our core themes, but brings in enabling health and well-being, protecting the environment, delivering a resilient transport network, and delivering economic growth and embracing innovation. And the bus network is part of that. And how we'll deliver on the local transport plan is something through called multimodal area investment plans, where we'll look at an integrated approach to transport and multimodal transport solutions to deliver what communities in those areas, because we're going to break them down into areas, need. And that might be more bus priority, more bus focused, or it might be near protecting bus services in rural communities, and enables us to have the flexibility in transport policy and implementation terms to deliver what our community needs. So we've taken that approach as a county council to start putting in the policy foundations and strategy blocks to enable us to be flexible and to utilise our funding to the maximum, and the bus network is a key element of that for us.
Okay, well, crucially, as far as Unite are concerned, we need a sustainable method of funding for the bus sector, which doesn't apply at the moment. And although we're talking about outside of London, I think, within London, as Mr. Summer indicated before, Transport for London has just lately become a tremendous success for, I would say, the operators, for the City of London, and for the bus drivers as well. And if we copied that nationally, then that would bring in £340 million, which then could be put back into the industry to as I said before, bring us the sustainable funding. Now, again, I'm sorry to keep going back to last week when I got on a bus, but it's happening a lot just lately. I am finding that things are being missed out, things that people notice. And the bus that I got on at the weekend, in midday, when there was a little bit of sunshine as well, I couldn't see out of the windows because they'd not been washed for quite a long period. Now, the same thing happened when I got the bus back. And if the money was used properly, instead of being funneled off in profit to the shareholders, instead, if we used it on the buses themselves, then we would get that sustainable funding model that I mentioned.
Simon, anything to add?
I think in terms of modal shift, we've got to try and find the balance between deterring car use and making bus really attractive. And the best way to make bus really attractive is a longer term, multi-year funding package for local authorities that enables a commitment to infrastructure, because we know that bus users value journey reliability, journey times far higher than price or anything really. They know it's going to be reliable and they know it's going to get them where they want to go. They're going to use the bus. So I think for me, it's finding that right level of carrot and stick, but also looking at where's been really, really successful. And we've all mentioned a couple of places already where there's really good practice, where we really delivered, but mostly in partnership, really delivered patronage growth. And if we can harness that and expand it into other areas, then we've got a chance of being successful.
Okay, thank you for those answers. They've been quite broad and covering the sort of breadth of the issues. We need to now sort of pin down some specifics, and could I ask that you keep answers short, and if there's nothing to add, you don't have to answer it, because I do want to get through all our questions before the next panel comes on. Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. The government has said that it intends to repeal the ban in the 2017 Act on local authorities creating new companies for the purpose of providing bus services. Do you think that lifting the ban on new municipal operators will have an impact in non-metropolitan areas?
If I can start from a Leicestershire County Council view, I think it presents a lot of opportunities, but also risks. Just noting in terms of the impact on sort of a non-urban authorities, it could be seen that the operating costs could be higher in a market that's not really large enough in entity. So Leicestershire's bus network isn't really large enough to support itself. and we would have to work with neighbouring authorities, and that's not just the city, that's neighbouring county authorities as well, because some of our bus services run to Coventry and Rugby and Northampton. So it might be a much more significant operating cost compared to the commercial operation that we have at present. But also, it could also limit innovation and efficiencies if it's not done well, and our ability to recruit the best people. And then there's the reputational risk on the local authorities in terms of if it's owned and how well the service it provides. But as I say, there's significant opportunities. It could help counteract some of the monopolies that we have in areas where there's limited commercial interest, and offering better value for money for our communities, and that's something that's quite important in terms of that we want to get the best deal for our communities. But also bringing skills into local authority company from the industry, which will in itself will bring innovation and perhaps new ways of working into the way we operate as local authorities. So we see at the moment that there's a number of opportunities, but also a number of risks. We'd look forward to seeing more detail if it was to come forward.
I mean, I think no matter what the setup and who has the control, I guess, of bus services, for me, it's more about the challenges remain the same. So a municipal bus company is still going to have the challenge of the funding settlement, the congestion, some of that, sort of the land use planning aspects. So I think for me, there's all kinds of different models and we're happy to work in partnership with lots of people. It's trying to address those challenges are more important necessarily than who owns or runs the buses, I suspect.
Can I just say that, again, going back to the profits that are made, they're usually given to shareholders, whereas if we have the local council running the bus services, and it's been proven, I think we've got nine operations left that are run by the council, or that are owned by the council, should I say, and I champion them, and I've always described them as wonderful companies, because usually there's a profit to be made unless they are badly managed. There's a profit to be made which makes the local council happy. The wages are always good. The terms and conditions, I should say, are always good, which makes the drivers very, very happy. And they also seem to have the best record for pleasing passengers, which makes the passengers happy. So you've got a model there which has been adopted by London, which works. It's been proved to work, and I'm absolutely delighted that the ban has been lifted.
Very quickly, to quote some excellent work that our neighbouring subnational transport body, England's Economic Heartland, have done with Sistra on bus models in regions such as ours. Their views on municipal bus companies, there's pros. For example, it does help to achieve the integrated approach from a local authority control perspective, and it does allow for that long-term view. One of the key sort of cons or risks is around the high cost to the local authorities. And as others have said, it doesn't remove the risk to the local authorities. And for local authorities in our area to take it on, it's the revenue risk bit that currently they're really struggling to get past. So hopefully that's a quick answer there.
Okay. Are you done? You got another question?
Perhaps, Scott, did you want you coming in?
Sorry, Scott. You wanted to come in. I do apologise.
You read my mind, Lawrence. Thank you very much. So just the point Robert was making there about municipal ownership. You know, I'm from Edinburgh. It's not in England, but we do have a municipal bus company there. And as Robert alludes, the drivers are well paid, highly unionised workforce. I think over 90%, and the buses are clean, which is a point you made as well, Robert, which is really, really important. And Simon, I really want to get to my question now after flattering Robert a little bit. You said that you didn't see ownership as the issue, but the observation I would make about Edinburgh, and I was a councillor there for a few years, is that because it's a municipal owner, they didn't just look for profitable routes. What they did was run a network as a whole, where some routes perhaps a commercial operator wouldn't be that interested in, because they were running a network with these different routes connected, and people would use more than one bus sometimes to go to A to B. That really worked. So do you think that would be a benefit of municipal ownership, or do you think that's already happening with the kind of delivery model we have just now?
I mean, we would very much hope to be running networks in the places we have, but the deregulated model outside of London means we have to run bus services legally that make money. We're not really allowed to cross-subsidise, run loss-making routes. Sometimes there's some genuine reasons for doing that to support a network, but the way that the 1985 Transport Act set it up was private bus companies are there to run profitable routes because we don't want to distort the market, and it's therefore the duty, although not a statutory duty, of the local authorities to step in and provide and fund services that are not provided in that commercial way. Because I suspect that's not a statutory requirement on local authorities, some authorities take a different view on supporting services that may not otherwise be commercially run. But we want as many people to travel on buses as possible. It's in our interest to do that, but we also need to work within the rules we've got.
Back to you, Lawrence, I think.
Can you say a little bit more, please, Simon, about what you just said about that you can't run loss-making routes at all, or there's a very limited amount of cross-subsidy? That's just within your own operation, not in the context of a wider bus network. So in
the way that it was set up in 1985 Transport Act and deregulated buses outside of London, we aren't allowed to distort the market by running services that are loss-making, because it might prevent entry to the market, or it might mean that it's anti-competitive in some way. So there is a duty on us to run routes that are profitable. Now, we might take sometimes a more nuanced view about how we set that up, because you might say, well, actually, this route feeds into all these other routes, and therefore, as a network of an operation, we understand that we're meeting our requirement to be profitable. The requirement was set out that it was therefore the local authority to step in when routes needed to be provided that weren't otherwise provided.
Right. Okay.
But that's been interpreted by different authorities over many years in different ways, and some authorities have been very generous. Some authorities have, I think Cumbria is an example, where they basically didn't run any supported services for about 10 years or so. Okay. They do a little bit now.
And subsequent legislation and policy doesn't trump that fundamental underlying, and it's basically how different authorities have interpreted that and worked with the private sector to even out that difference.
Right.
Yeah, okay. So, Kath, did you want to come in again, Catherine?
Yes, very briefly on that. I think the concern that I've had in some routes is even when a route was actually very popular, if it was popular with those on concessionary fares or not having to pay, or with kind of students and young families, that might not be commercially profitable, even though that the social value of that route is very, very high. So do you feel that at the moment the rules under which you operate are actually detrimental in prioritising profit over social value?
I don't know if I'd say or agree that it's the rules that we operate in, but I guess it's the rules in which the industry is operating would be interesting to be looked at, because there's never really been, as far as I understand it, a really clear definition of what socially, in the Act in 1985, what socially necessary really means. And it's certainly not, as I said before, been made a statutory requirement. So some authorities have tried to fund quite a bus network, and some authorities have taken a very different view to that. And of course, as funding has got tighter over time, there's obviously difficult decisions to be made. So I think it's not necessarily about the rules we operate in, but how the industry is structured, I guess.
Thank you.
Picking up on that last point, ministers have said that they intend to include a measure on socially necessary bus services in the forthcoming bill. How do you think socially necessary should be defined? I'd also be interested if witnesses have a view on who should make the decision under the forthcoming legislation on which services are socially necessary.
Well, if I can just say, the word, or the two words that were used earlier on were commercially run, and if I convert that into my language, that means unless I can make money out of you as a passenger, I'm not really interested. And that brings me to people who live in urban areas, for instance, where we all see just lately that all of the banks in the big cities now are closing different branches and so on. And that means that people that live in the urban areas actually have to move. They don't have banks. They have to move into the big cities in order to withdraw their wages, if you like. And there are all kinds of reasons why they are being forced into the cities. But those same people don't have a socially viable bus service that will take them along, because there's no profit in the bus services that are being applied. And they're the people that need looking after most of all. If there's no bus, what do? You take the car. If you're on low wages and you don't have a car, then you're actually stuck there. You can't go in a taxi because you've not got the money to do it.
And just come in on that question. So my view is you have to focus on the problem you're trying to solve and the outcomes you're trying to deliver here, and use data and evidence to identify what is sort of socially valuable services. Now, from our perspective in Transport East, we've done a lot of work with our partner Transport for the North on transport-related social exclusion. We've done an analysis across the whole of the east of England, identified that 25% of people in the east live in areas where there is transport-related social exclusion. And I think to your point earlier on about young people as well, we've done a survey to hone in on young people and the challenges they face. We surveyed 1,000 young people late last year and looked particularly at buses. And these were young people, sort of 16 to 20, so those in higher education. They identified their long travel times. 32% of them said it took 1 to 2 hours to get to educational training. Over 60% of them were paying £30 a week to get to college, and 2/3 not arriving on time, so missing lessons because of the paucity of the public transport network. Just sort of indulge me a little bit, we took a lot of quotes as well from people, and one quote that really stood out was, my granddad retired to take me to college, and as my mum is disabled and my dad works full time. And so what we're really getting into here is there's data and evidence around social exclusion that we can start to use as measures to be able to analyse this going forward. And I think our view is that you use evidence such as that to be able to create those benchmarks to identify where are those socially excluded routes that we need to tackle, and you use that evidence base to identify that, focused on the outcomes for society that we're trying to address here.
If I could just come in as well, we've obviously through the work we've done on our LTP4, we have a lot of similar comments from our community that link similar to Andrew's about the costs of people trying to get to education opportunities and health facilities. And that one of the stories that I heard through LTP4 was about a girl who has autism. She uses the bus to get to college, but if the bus gets too full, she has to get off. And then waits for the next bus to get on, and can do that repeatedly. In one day it costs her £12 to get to college. So there's these huge challenges, and I think it comes down to the ethos that passenger transport is really a public service. We're delivering a public service for people, and perhaps we've kind of lost that perspective over time, and perhaps we need to re-establish that. But in doing so, we need to whilst we need to understand each area has its own needs and requirements for the bus network. So Leicestershire's needs will be very different from, say, Birmingham's or the South or London. There needs to be a clear national understanding of why passenger transport is so important and the role it needs to play in supporting and enabling our communities to live their daily lives. I think that's the key bit that needs to come forward at that national level. So really, it's across all levels to take ownership of it in terms of making sure we're delivering the services that our communities require.
Just to refine the question perhaps a bit, do you think that it's possible to define socially necessary in the legislation itself, or do you think we're going to be left with a similar situation today? Perhaps we'll have guidance, but it won't be defined in primary or secondary legislation.
There does need to be some level of definition, especially where you've got, for example, Leicestershire rural counties with rural communities, often which have a significant level of deprivation themselves, or an ageing population who necessarily can't rely on a car or use a car. And so I do think there needs to be a level of a definition around that in terms of what does constitute as an essential service at that national level within the legislation.
I think just expanding on that, articulating the outcome would be really helpful, but there does need to be some degree of flexibility for the local area to be able to define it. And I think as we go through devolution as well, and more mayoral strategic authorities come on board, giving them a little bit of flexibility to define that based on the data for their area. But I agree, an outcome at a national level would be really helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll go to Scott now.
Thanks for that. Thank you, Chair. I think on young people, I think as a committee, perhaps something we should look at is the under 21 free bus travel in Scotland. It's not been without its problems, but for some people, it's been transformative actually. On to my questions. So we've spoke broadly about what's been behind the decline in bus services across England. But obviously, we know there's specific issues in rural routes and connecting services there. So very briefly, we just look at rural routes very briefly. What's been behind the decline in services there? Our notes here tell us 1 in 4 services have disappeared since 2010. That sounds absolutely incredible to me. So very briefly, what's been behind that?
From our perspective as Leicestershire County Council, it's the commercial viability of those services in terms of the patronage numbers and versus the cost to actually operate those services. It can be challenging because you've got to operate a level of service for people to be able to get to the facilities that they need, but they don't necessarily need that bus service all the time, every day, and it's finding a balance in terms of delivering that service. The other challenge is often what we've had to do is extend bus routes or consider extending bus routes that perhaps serve an urban area where they get more customers as they head in towards the city, but then they're undermined by reliability because they also get caught in the congestion of that area, and therefore there isn't the reliable service out to that rural community.
And it can be more infrequent as well, so missing your bus is a huge issue.
Yeah. So we're now having to look at other options for our bus network and around demand responsive transport. We've done the HoC Connect trial within Leicestershire to see how that's working, and that trial does seem to be quite successful, but we're now having to think innovatively and outside the box to see what level of service and provision we can provide our rural communities that's cost effective for ourselves as a council, because generally we will have to subsidise those routes. When they become commercially viable, we then have to usually step in to subsidise them, but that's becoming increasingly challenging, and our ability to do that is becoming challenging due to the financial situation in terms of our funding coming forward.
Anybody want to add to that?
Just some evidence from a travel behaviour survey that we completed last year. So we surveyed 4,000 people across the east of England to really understand their travel habits, and rural buses was a key thing. There was a clear disparity between rural and urban. So overall, 46% of people had access to a bus, but only 30% in rural areas. 30% of people had used a bus, but only 14% had used it in rural areas. And the top 4 things that they said were, the challenges around infrequent services, limited early and evening services, and that was seen as a real barrier to people using buses because you can't get back from, say, nighttime employment, even though you could get there.
Again, an issue for young people who tend to work.
Exactly, yeah. Not direct routes and taking too long to get to destinations. And as others have said, a lot of the reasons behind that is the financial viability of providing that across a sparser population. So, for example, Suffolk have 240 bus routes, commercial bus routes across their network, and all of them require some form of public subsidy, and 40 of them are fully funded through subsidy as well. So the viability is really difficult across these rural areas, resulting in those symptoms that I've just said.
Yeah, huge cost, that number of routes. Yeah. Anything else?
Can I just say that the question's been answered a number of times this morning. They're not profitable routes, and they are abandoned by the operators. They're just not profitable. Now, I don't want anyone to think that I'm against profit. I think it can be a good thing for all parties represented here today, but I would like to see more money poured back into the industry rather than it going out to the shareholders. And one of the great things that concerns me lately is that I'm jointly heading up a situation in Unite. We have what we call the Get Me Home Safely campaign, which is basically looking after the safety of women on the streets. And it's been described as an MP just lately that the number of attacks on women on the streets has now become a national emergency because it happens that often, both in daylight and at night time as well. Now, if a bus is coming along on a regular basis, then that can be a help to these women who may be in trouble. That's something that we are working on. But if it doesn't make profit, then we don't get those routes. However, if the money's poured into it instead of going to the shareholders, then we have a bigger chance of doing it.
Yeah, we have to remember it's called a bus service. It's a service, not a commercial operation, hopefully, always. So is there anything we can do then to protect and extend the routes which are still left? Is there any specific issues, anything we do, apart from greater levels of subsidy that's already made? And you've spoken about DRT, Ben. Is there anything else people want to add to that in terms of how we protect things going forward?
Make one more point, and that's in terms of the Green Book terms as well, in terms of investment in rural areas. Generally it's always seen that have a poor return of money in terms of providing that investment or that service, but actually the social benefits outweigh the actual financial benefits or the financial costs potentially of providing that rural service. So I think there does need to be an element of the Green Book, a review of the Green Book or consideration of the Green Book to provide greater emphasis on those social aspects and environmental benefits as well, because obviously a bus service can reduce car usage, which is better for the environment, but at the moment it isn't there. So I think that would help as well, because that would give a greater benefit weighting in terms of putting that investment into rural bus services.
And that's a key point, because we're talking about younger people and older people finding it harder to access those bus services. The cost of that in the longer term is huge in terms of social isolation and also access work and education. So it's really, really important. So is there any specific types of services? And I think we've really covered this, either connecting destinations or services to people that we should be more concerned about in rural areas. I think you spoke about services that would only be used occasionally, perhaps to healthcare, which are really essential when you do need them, but you're not using them every day. Is there anything else?
And I think one of the interesting points, and probably one of the more successful provisions of rural transport for many years now, has been the community transport network, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think some of that community transport element has relied a lot on volunteers, some of whom maybe have stopped doing that for age reasons or whatever. Probably has a bit of an image issue, community transport, sometimes, about whether that would be attractive to a younger person to use because it's perceived to be for a certain demographic. There's obviously been other attempts with DRT, and it's been mentioned already, but kind of community transport as a sort of feeder into trunk bus routes or connecting into the edge of an urban area to connect with bus routes does feel still like part of the answer of an integrated transport solution. And community transport has never sort of gone away, and as I said, has been quite successful in the past. So perhaps community transport would be something that could be considered further.
Yeah, and of course, and it is really, really important, really important. So let's hope DRT is the rebranding of it to make it more interesting and more exciting to younger people. Let's hope. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Alex.
Thank you. The government's new buses bill says that it aims to empower local authorities to improve their bus services. Can you explain what you think empowerment should look like and how local authorities can be best supported to do that?
I have to kick off on that one. So from our conversations that we've had in the East, it's very much around what type of model could be better than what we've got already, and so this is where franchising question starts to come in quite a lot. And it's very much around a lot of analysis that's taken place. So, for example, just outside of our patch, but the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority have done some analysis comparing the enhanced partnership model that a lot of our authorities have at the minute compared to the franchising model, and started to look at where the advantages could be. I think overall the strategic and economic case was broadly similar. But it's the sort of the financial and procurement case in that was seen as the key risk that a lot of our local authorities at the minute, which is kind of on offer through the latest legislation, probably can't feel that they could take. But I think where the opportunity may come is through the alignment with devolution as well. So a really, I guess, interesting sort of situation in the east of England is all of our local authorities will be going through devolution over the next year or so. In May next year, we'll have the mayoral elections for Norfolk, Suffolk and Greater Essex. And I think that's where some interesting interesting conversations can take place between, does that scale start to allow more franchising or start to move towards that type of model than can currently take under the constraints of the existing system. One of the key things aligned to that will be the integrated transport settlements that mayoral authorities will have, and that will start to crack some of the questions and problems that we've already talked around in terms of that long-term funding. So it feels that there's a package of both the measures that are in the latest legislation plus other things that are happening as well that collectively could happen. And I go back to the point that this isn't in isolation. There's a package of things that the government are doing. I would say the other opportunity here is in the planning and infrastructure bill, and particularly around the opportunities to align planning with bus service provision as well. So mayors will be responsible for spatial development strategies that bring together transport and planning in one place. So I think what we're starting to see is there's tools available both through the Act, but also if you combine these with the other tools that are available through other legislation, you start to get that whole systems package that I think is going to be needed to deliver this. It's not a single thing, it's a systems approach.
I think assuming that empowerment comes with the right sort of funding approach, then I would very much hope that empowerment looked like very much locally led partnership working, because I think bus services are best delivered when they're delivered in local partnership, that it empowers those authorities to invest in the infrastructure that helps improve bus journey times and reliability, that they can be empowered to look at measures to deter car use, to encourage modal shift, but also to help them be empowered to look at some of the skills gap that I think we've seen emerge in the local authority transport teams in more recent times. So that would be how I would hope they would empower themselves.
I think from my perspective, I agree with what Andrew said. I think the key opportunity for us will be through what opportunities that come through devolution and local government reorganisation. As I said, Leicestershire, we can't sustain a bus network on franchising alone. We'd need to go with other parties. And through devolution, there's that potential of cross-boundary franchising with other key geographical areas, so not just the wider Leicestershire area with the city and Rutland, but also wider with other neighbouring authorities.
Yeah, I think that the vast majority of local authorities, they get the subsidies, but they don't seem to understand what they're supposed to do with the subsidies. In this case, it should be supporting the bus sector, but that doesn't happen. So once again, it comes down to sustainable funding where money is available. I think not so long ago, this government made available something like £3.5 billion towards the industry, of which £1.5 billion has been spent. So that means that somewhere along the line, some bank account has got £1.5 billion laying there, probably gathering interest, and that money should actually be spent on the sector instead of lying there in a bank vault.
I somehow doubt it's in a bank vault. Rachel Reeves would have found it. Andrew, you were talking about the potential for franchising using the example of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. But when you read the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough business case, actually the overall level of subsidy remains identical throughout the entire period that they're talking about. And many people on the panel have basically been saying it's about money. So can we hone down more on, is it about money or is it about powers and responsibilities? So what is it that extra, that devolution is bringing that we don't have at the moment within an enhanced partnership, for example?
So I think it's for the customer themselves and the integration with other modes and the wider transport system. So yes, absolutely right. The money's the same in both. But what that devolution of powers, both for buses and other transport functions, enables is a better customer approach. So if you look at, I guess, TfL, I guess, is the gold standard example. But if you even look at Cornwall, so Transport for Cornwall, where what they've been able to do is develop, the one Cornwall brand. So all of the Cornwall buses, all of the travel information is under this very easy to use customer focused experience. That then starts to bring together and integrate transport in place. The other thing that the mayors are able to do is start to align buses with other modes of transport and planning for them as well. So if you think, I guess, a micro example of a transport corridor, currently, through the sort of current funding process, a local authority would look at a bus lane on its own. What this starts to bring together is a sort of a total streets approach where they could look at all the different modes on a corridor at the same time. So really allowing that integrated provision. That starts to make sure that, you know, could start to overcome some of the community opposition to things like bus lanes. So there really is, you know, an opportunity through the integration with the other modes that the powers that mayors have that currently don't have at the minute, and that single political direction as well, and that leadership, which where we've seen in areas with mayors, has actually been really important in driving things through. So making difficult decisions could be easier under that mayoral body.
Okay, and to anybody, are there any aspects over which you think that central government should be retaining control?
So I think we would very much, although we would support the general approach of devolution, I think very much things like BSOG payments, we would like that to be kept as it is. I think from a central government point of view, as I said before, that more clear steer and even making it a requirement of providing social necessary services, the definition aside, that requirement to do that would be very important, and a central government role.
Okay, I just wanted to ask Ben and/or Andy the question about this brave new world, devolution of powers, more joined-up thinking, using opportunities that previous legislation or policy didn't allow. Does local government, in its different facets, have the skills and officer capacity to do this stuff and to do it well? And if not, what needs to be done?
I mean, so just picking this up, so one of the main things our local authorities have said to us is no. You know, a lot of local authorities don't have that capacity and capability. I guess the short-term funding process to date has not allowed long-term procurement and recruitment. And the other thing I think a lot of our local authorities have said is that a lot of the skills lie in people that are going to retire, you know, relatively soon. And I guess the younger generation of bus planners isn't necessarily coming through at the scale that we need in places like the East to really drive this forward. If you look at some of the large metropolitan areas, they have sort of very large teams of people that are needed to do this, for example, Transport for London and Manchester. And that capacity and capability just isn't in places like the East of England at the minute, and that would need to be addressed.
I mean, given where your regions, sub-regions are, on this journey, and you know, in a different place to the big Mets, have you got any advice for government or any recommendations you'd make, given the journey you're going through on this issue of capacity, officer capacity?
I think from the county council's perspective, in terms of Leicestershire, I think it's that multi-year funding. It is crucial for us to be able to plan long term and plan for those changes and those investments. At the moment, we're working on annual year settlements. That means we have to be very reactive in terms of the funding that we get to try and make decisions very quickly.
Impact on staffing. I'm particularly focusing on the skills.
It does impact upon staffing,
right,
because
okay.
Because we necessarily won't have the capability or capacity in-house to suddenly deliver a large programme of funding if we receive it. So we've got to scale up very quickly, or we have to scale down, whereas a long-term funding settlement enables us to manage that situation, plan for it, get schemes ready that we can commit to and implement over that period. At the moment, it's quite a struggle. And you know, and that's what we're finding with our BSIP funding at the moment. We've got BSIP funding, but we're having to prioritise and work out what we need to deliver over quite a tight timescale.
Yeah, if you want to recruit someone, you want to offer them a permanent contract, and if you have only 1 year funding, you can't do that. So the long-term funding is vital.
Alex?
So I understand what you're saying about people being there, and that the long-term funding helps for that. But the other point is what skills those officers have, because we are moving increasingly to a new world, aren't we? Officers traditionally have been providing, you know, sticking plaster solutions to services that didn't work and never would. Now we're talking about officers that need the skills in financial modelling, in performance monitoring, you know, in contract negotiation. It's an entirely different thing, particularly if you move to full franchising. But even when we're now talking about enhanced partnerships or the quality contract schemes that the government have put into the buses bill. So how do we make sure that officers have got that new set of skills as opposed to just them being there for a long time?
At Leicestershire County Council, we actually have apprenticeship and graduate schemes and programmes within the Environment and Transport Department, which is my department, and those graduates and apprentices move around the various departments, including Sustainable Travel, where the bus operations sit, my department, which is Transport Strategy and Policy, to get that experience of transport planning, because we've realised we need to grow our own in-house capability and expertise in terms of this. We've got a lot of officers who are very knowledgeable and know about things, and you know, the transport plan profession is an ageing profession, and we're losing that knowledge and experience, but we recognise we need to pass it down to our future generations if we are to survive and deliver the transport networks which our communities need. So we've taken those steps to do that already.
I guess just adding to your list of skills, I would also add partnership working, relationship managing, marketing. This is a multifaceted skill set that's required. You're absolutely right. We've talked in the East about the potential for some sort of graduate scheme whereby you bring through the next generation of transport planners, perhaps sharing between local authorities in our region, with Transport for London, with the government. This is an initiative that could really take off. I think buses could be one of the key themes that we focus on with that, and I think it'd be great if that was a recommendation of this work.
A number of people I come across who've worked for Transport for London and now work for all sorts of different employers. Okay, Katie.
Thank you, Chair. Trying to bring together various points on socially necessary services, demand, devolution, what do you make of the idea of a government guarantee of minimum service levels in buses across England? I think that would address some of the reliability issues you raised. I know in the rural part of Kent that I represent, lots of people just give up on the bus because it's not frequent enough to be relied upon or to be useful. But perhaps it's another way of thinking about buses in a silo. Maybe it would be better to let local authorities decide. Could something like that ever realistically be affordable? I'm just interested in your thoughts.
I mean, I think that there has to be some sort of answer probably to the gap, I guess, that's come about from that 1985 Transport Act about how is it that bus services that aren't necessarily profitable going to be provided, different approaches to that. I wouldn't want there to be a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to that, so I don't think there could ever be a situation where central government would try and say what that was, but if it was kind of locally decided, maybe done in partnership, using local knowledge, something like that, yes, could potentially help with the rural services that we've been talking about.
Can I just say that and it refers to the last question as well, that the skills and capacity are already there and available and ready to be used. And I use as an example what's going on in Manchester, where we have TFGM, and Andy Burnham's team are working very, very closely with Unite to provide a proper service for the public, and as well to provide a proper job for the people who are driving the buses as well, who at the moment are unfortunately suffering from all kinds of fatigue. So I think that the minimum service levels should be not imposed, but should be brought in. I would be delighted to see that. And there has to be some control over the operators who, at the moment, I wouldn't say they're not concerned about the problem, but they're not fixing the problem.
I think for Leicestershire, a minimum level of service is needed. We're reliant on our bus network. It is crucial. We don't have an extensive rail network like other cities and surrounding urban areas have. So we have the Leicester railway station, we have South Wigston, Narborough, Market Harbour and Melton and Loughborough are our key train stations. So we don't have that local rail connectivity. So our bus network is the key driver of moving people around if you can't rely upon cars. So having that minimum level of service is probably very important to us, because that's our key form of public transport that we have as the county.
I think you'd have to be very clear about how you define the minimum level and what you're measuring there. Some of the feedback from our local authorities is in the past it's been tried, but it's very where you don't have the funding to deliver it, it ultimately fails. So you need to have some sort of degree of flexibility around the measure. I think the other thing that's been articulated is what would you articulate the minimum service to be? Is it between a village and a town? I guess the challenge is that not everyone wants to go from that village to that town. It might be that they want to go to other places, and so you start to get this quite complex network of minimum level of service that you have to provide, and then you run into the problems that we've already talked about. So it probably goes into the back to the outcomes, and then gives some degree of flexibility to the local areas to be able to decide that. But I agree that the concept, as others have said, is a good one to ensure that is that accessibility to tackle that social exclusion that we've already talked about today.
Okay, thank you. We are sort of slightly pressed for time, although some of the issues have been covered in questions that we were due to answer now, so partly my fault. So can I go to Ollie now, please?
Thank you, Chair. Some of you have already touched on the challenge of making bus competitive with car, which has clear advantages, certainly on the surface in terms of convenience and attractiveness. Certainly in my constituency, we see some good examples of integration between bus and rail, like at Didcot Parkway, but it tends to be less good in the evening when bus frequencies decline, and some parts of the constituency, like Stamford in the Vale, have only got an hourly daytime service and then nothing in the evening. So in that context, what role do you feel buses should play in the government's integrated transport strategy?
And I think they should be at the absolute heart of it. They're the most used public transport mode in the country. They're so essential for so many people, and if we can find the right way to make them even better, then they're going to be used by even more people. So I think it's got to be looked at as a whole package. We've got to think about, everybody's got some sort of journey to make to get to the bus stop. So we've got to think about what does that look like, particularly in rural areas. Many of the features of urban bus stops, for example, so nice curbing, tarmac, bus stop pole, clear information, don't necessarily exist outside of urban areas. So it's all got to be thought about from that point of view. Is it being made as attractive as possible in those rural areas, and are people getting the whole journey experience? But yeah, buses have got to be absolutely key.
Hey, Catherine.
Thank you. Mr Morton, you've raised the real issues with bus driver shortages several times, and Unite has reported a current driver shortfall of 4,000. What impact would you say that driver shortages have had on bus services viability and reliability?
That's like the $64 million question, and I'll try and give a proper answer. We have to look at why is there a shortage. I mean, when I was a lot younger, there were loads of people wanted to work on the buses. It was an ideal of many youngsters at the time. That ideal has slipped away now because no one, well, when I say no one, a lot of people don't wish to work on the buses, and even the drivers that we have now are becoming more and more disillusioned with their lot. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is low wages. There are places where you can work driving a bus for the same money as you would get stacking shelves in one of the larger supermarkets. Now, that doesn't apply across the board, obviously, but it does in some places. So there are low wages, there are long hours, and I attended a branch meeting not so long ago, bus drivers, and they were all, as usual, making complaints, which I get used to when I go to bus drivers' meetings. And one of the things that I noticed that no one spoke about, everyone in the room, apart from myself, were drinking cans of Red Bull. And if people don't know what Red Bull is, it's a sugar-infused drink that gives you energy, or in a bus driver's case, makes you better equipped to fight the fatigue
It's caffeine, it keeps you awake.
Yeah.
Well, there are other things in it as well. I don't want to go into all of the details on the can. Yes, but these people were drinking the Red Bull, and that was to make them able to drive the bus without closing their eyes. You start to close your eyes and you go asleep. And I'm deeply worried, and I have nightmares about this, whereby there will be a bus driving along the road full of passengers and so on, and it crashes into a bus stop full of people, and the reason that it does that is that the bus driver actually falls asleep at the wheel. Now, I've seen a recent happening in the London area where the driver did fall asleep, and it was due purely to fatigue. And very, very luckily for me and the driver and everyone else, no one was hurt. But it's only a matter of time that because of the fatigue, because of the extra hours people are having to work, then my nightmare will come true, and there will be a bus that actually causes damage through the driver being fatigued.
Anyone else that wants to come in on this?
I think if I could come in. So I think we've worked really hard to solve the bus driver shortage that was a clear problem when we came out of COVID. That changed fundamentally all kinds of different things for us in terms of how we look at our workforce and want to look after our bus drivers. There was a significant shortage across the industry and within First, but particularly in First, I would say in the last 6 months or so, all of our hard work to resolve that has come good. We do have a small vacancy gap, but it's nothing like what it was, and it's certainly not providing the impact on services that it was perhaps 18 months or 2 years ago. We're the largest bus operator to pay the real living wage. We've invested in flexible working arrangements. We've invested in healthcare for our drivers, learning centres, and fair wage awards. So it's largely been solved for First Bus. And we've also been tried to be quite nimble about when we needed to do things. So in the Norwich-Norfolk example, when the BSIP money was available to improve services, there was a risk we wouldn't be able to do that because of the driver shortage. But we actually worked in a different way. We took on some agency drivers to help with that. So we haven't also let it become necessarily a barrier to some of the growth that we wanted to see. But I think I would say largely resolved, but we need to keep working hard at it because it's a hard job, and we want people to do it because it's also very rewarding to carry your community about on a daily basis.
Some factors, 4 factors in rural areas for bus drivers that we've experienced. So one is where those areas overlay with tourist hotspots and therefore a large amount of second home ownership. Bus drivers priced out of the market in terms of housing, and therefore there isn't a pool of bus drivers available, particularly in areas such as North Norfolk and Suffolk Coast. We've seen that as an issue, and subsequently one of the operators in North Norfolk at the minute is doing a very proactive campaign with increased pay for bus drivers to try to reverse that. Second issue that we've been seeing in the East is because we've got a large amount of NSIPs coming in, for example Sizewell C, a lot of drivers will go to jobs for buses for those NSIP developments, taking them away from commercial. In Essex, going back to TfL, there's a lot of competition between Essex and London paying more for bus drivers, and therefore drivers that would be in Essex otherwise going to London. And I think the other thing about the East, as we're an international gateway, we've got 13 ports, a huge amount of freight, and so there's competition with freight for drivers as well, both HGV and also the increased amount of delivery jobs that are available as well. So there's competition from other driving jobs that are really causing an issue here across the board.
I mean, there's been a number of different issues and barriers you've talked about in relation to recruitment and retention, and I think a lot of that has been focused on recruitment, and I think pay is obviously a big part of it, but when it comes to retention, I think what have you found works and what more needs to be done?
I think the element about shifts and rotas, the flexible working element, how different people want to work and live their lives these days. So we've been looking very hard at all kinds of different versions of part-time working, casual hours, weekends only. We've become much more open to having people working something different to what was the traditional 5/7, 37-hour week. That just doesn't work anymore. So we've really had to adapt to attract and then retain people, how they work with us, and what we're willing to be flexible on in terms of hours, days of the week, and that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you. And I think just the last question, but covering an issue we've not gone into a lot of detail on. So could I ask Alex?
Yes. How effective do you think the government's recent £1 billion of funding allocation for bus services is going to be at improving bus services across those more rural and suburban areas? And also, actually, bring it in at the same time. A lot of you have spoken about long-term funding settlements. What period do you think long-term is? What timescale would be appropriate?
Happy to kick off on that. In our spending review submission to Treasury a few weeks ago, we were very clear. It's 5 years confirmed funding plus 5 years indicative. So a 10-year funding horizon to really give that certainty to local authorities that they can plan for the future to tackle the issues we've talked about today.
I think from our perspective, it's interesting. The Zebra 2 initiative for us, we got funding allocated on Zebra 2 to try and provide electrified buses onto rural networks, but then the rules and the procedures that we had to go through actually then restricted our ability to deliver it because it was more focused on urban areas. And I think that's the biggest challenge, that we welcome funding and we welcome any support that we can have to deliver our bus network. But the challenge for us is when we have those constraints and barriers placed upon us, as we've heard from the discussion this morning, that then prevent us actually being able to deliver on what we need to and to invest that money to the benefit of our communities.
Can I just say, when you ask the question, how long, it should be as long as it works. And when I say as long as it works, so that everyone that it affects is happy with the way the funding is spent. I wouldn't put a figure on how long it should be, but if it's working, then it can go on forever. If it's not working, then you change it right away, and you get back to the state where it is working, and once again, for as long as it's working, that's how long it should be there.
And then finally, just the question of risk. In the new world that we're going towards, in terms of more franchising, enhanced partnerships, enhanced partnership plus, we're going to be in a situation whereby local transport authorities are retaining the fare box income. That clearly has some possibility for reward, but also possibility for risk. I was wondering, from a local authority perspective, how you will be calculating that risk, but also it has a fundamental change for the private operators as well. Your risk is going to change as well. So what risks do you see from a private operator point of view as well? Because you're still going to be in the market in franchising, but yet your business model is going to change.
I mean, I'll start if I may. Our risks are more around adapting ourselves and getting the right skills, and it's not dissimilar to what was said about local authorities, to have the right skill set to move into more of a bidding for work process, not necessarily an operating buses mindset. We've got to have different, and we're busy doing that. But then also the risk really is about we're committing to a 5, maybe a 7-year tender or a franchise, and we've got to get our things right as part of that. So to avoid anything, so we've got to be much better at predicting the future, committing to a much more long-term sort of setup than perhaps we're used to.
I think from our perspective is that we can't consider franchising at the moment alone, and we're considering what our options are. So we're still in an enhanced partnership working with the bus operators and Leicester City Council to deliver our bus network. But we do recognise the benefits that can come from that in terms of providing better value for money, in terms of bus routes, but also being more nimble and innovative in the way we provide those local services, and especially rural services. So I quoted DRT as an example earlier. So it'd be more, there's those opportunities with it. But at the moment, as an authority, and the local transport authority, we're just not in a position to consider it at the moment.
Okay, I'm afraid we've run way over time, and I do want to give the second panel an equal chance. We didn't cover sufficiently the potential imbalance of... So these are things you may want to write to us on, your thoughts. The imbalance of BSIP funding between rural and urban areas, cost drivers being within local authorities' control and how they vary between different kinds of area, and also your thoughts on the fare cap. Okay, thank you. So that brings us to the end of our first panel, and thank you for your evidence. And I say, do write to us on anything on those issues and anything you thought we didn't cover sufficiently. I'm going to suspend the session for a few moments so that our next witnesses can take their place at the table. The sitting is suspended. Order. Welcome, order. Welcome to our second panel, and could I ask you to introduce yourselves, starting with Paul?
Good morning, everyone. My name's Paul Miner. I'm Head of Policy and Planning at the CPRE, the Countryside Charity, formerly known as the Campaign to Protect Rural England, and I'm also a Chartered Town Planner.
Good morning, I'm Silviya Barrett. I'm Director of Policy and Campaigns at the Charity Campaign for Better Transport.
Good morning, I'm Stephen Frost. I'm the Head of Transport Policy at the Institute for Public Policy Research.
Good morning, Professor Karen Lucas, Director of the Manchester Urban Institute, Professor of Geography at University of Manchester.
Excellent. So, to each of you, what does transport-related social exclusion mean in practice, and how widespread do you think it is? I'll start with Paul.
Thanks very much, Chair. In terms of rural bus services, I think we can see social exclusion happening on a number of fronts. So in particular, the effects on older people being able to access services, but also younger people being able to stay connected and to reach schools and colleges. But I think that looking into it more widely, that there's clear issues of class, gender and disability. The gender issue was put very powerfully in a recent paper by Unison, which the committee is aware of, which showed that being unable to access rural bus services particularly impacts women who are often likely to have childcare or other care responsibilities and also be in lower paid or more precarious work. There was also work done for Transport for the North, which found that there were particular effects on people with disabilities as well in terms of reduced access to bus services. And similarly to the others, there are also issues of class as well, that people on lower incomes will often be unable to afford to buy a car or run a car, and in those cases will be particularly reliant on public transport.
Thank you, Silviya.
Thank you. There are many statistics that I have prepared that demonstrate the value of buses and the impact that bus cuts have on people. But I would like to start with relating some of the statements I have read from supporters of our charity, the thousands of supporters that we have who write to us every day with their experiences. And these are stories that really are heartbreaking. So I've read about whole villages being cut out, leaving people without any connectivity at all. people missing hospital appointments, disabled people or less able-bodied people who need to wait for a long time for a bus, not knowing when the next bus will turn up, even just for a few stops for a short journey. People making round trips to work that take 4 to 5 times longer by bus than they would if they were made by car. Children missing out on school activities, particularly in holidays because of services being infrequent. People being priced out of using buses even if they want to because of the increase in the fare cap. That has affected many people as well. So just going back to the statistics, in terms of the research we have done, in 2021 we did a report on left behind neighborhoods. These are the 10% most deprived communities with poor community infrastructure. And we found, so that's a top line finding, that 84% of those left behind neighborhoods have poorer transport connectivity than the national average. So that transport lack of connectivity is really exacerbating existing disadvantages. And just going back to the quotes that I've read, I mean, people used words like as outrageous and tragic in terms of the lack of connectivity that they're experiencing. So that really demonstrates to me that buses are an essential public service, and they need to be treated as such, and they need to be funded as such. So I hope we will come back to minimum level of service guarantee later on in the session. Egan?
I can't add a huge amount to that, but in terms of our understanding of transport-related social exclusion, it's the barriers that people face to accessing the opportunities to get on in life, to basic services, to community life and friends and family and kind of caring responsibilities. It's also the life challenges that are created by the cost of transport, the time spent travelling, and the stress and anxiety that can arise from trying to travel those long distances and trying to fit in everything that you're meant to do in our modern lives, particularly if you have caring responsibilities added onto the top of jobs and other parts to that. And as has been alluded to kind of here, that sits within a wider context of social, economic and environmental inequality that touches on issues of income and poverty, gender, we've heard already, but also sexuality and ethnicity and disability. Focusing in just on that issue of a kind of affordability of transport and the barriers that creates, in the work that Social Market Foundation have done, they found that the cost of transport was bringing 5 million people in Britain below the poverty line, and that's adding to an existing kind of 8 million people who are already below that poverty line. You can see the kind of role that travel can play in creating new barriers in people's lives through those kinds of statistics.
So I've been studying transport-related social exclusion since the last Labour government and the Social Exclusion Unit, and I don't see any reason to change the definition that they came up with, which was, you're in social exclusion from a transport-related course if you cannot easily, reliably, affordably access transport resources in order to carry out your key life-enhancing opportunities. So failure to be able to fully participate as a result of lack of transportation. And it's definitely a joint issue around social deprivation and poor public transport. Those two things are absolutely linked. And Transport for the North, which we heard about earlier on in the last panel, have been doing a lot of analysis to try and identify the areas and the populations that are affected in the worst places. They carried out that first analysis in 2019, and they found that 19 million people were at very high risk of transport-related social exclusion. So it's not a small issue. They've done that analysis again. They haven't quite published their report, but I've been allowed to release the figures, and that has gone up to 22 million people that live in areas that are at very high risk of transport-related social exclusion. I would have to say that at least half of those people will be relying on cars, even though they can't afford them, and therefore they have car-related economic stress, and there will only probably be one car in that household, and that means that not everybody in that household will have access to that car at any time. 10% of those low-income car owners will be suffering from economic stress in a way that means that they cannot afford food, they cannot afford shoes for their children, they cannot afford to basically pay their electricity bills. We know that there's this huge cost of living crisis. And the worst affected people, welfare claimants, definitely, but they may not be travelling so regularly. Low-paid workers, really, really badly, especially shift workers, especially also non-paid carers, because they have a lot of travel responsibilities for escorting their children and other people around. The young people not in employment, education and training, who will see the cost of transport as a barrier to them taking up any of those activities, and particularly low-income households with children. So it's not only a rural phenomenon, and sorry for me to go on about this, but it's my area, right? I probably won't talk much more. It affects, if you see the Transport for the North mapping, which is interactive, and you can go online and you can look at it at very, very small areas, which is output areas now for the latest one. Before it was lower super output areas, but you can literally look at it at the level of about 100 households, and you can see that it is spread across the whole of England. And we probably think Wales and Scotland as well, although that analysis has not been done, perhaps even worse. It's particularly, it is a rural issue, but there are much larger proportions of people in small urban conurbations and on the periphery of big cities. So we've been talking about Greater Manchester being one of the more capacitated cities, but there's plenty of incidents of transport-related social exclusion in places like Wigan, Rochdale, Oldham, all around the outskirts you can see it. Maybe less so in Salford, which is a bit more central and has got the metro going there. Most of these areas will be bus dependent. Most of these areas are maybe have one or two train stations, very poor connectivity between the buses and the rail. We've had that already, the integrated stuff. And as our colleagues here have said, it is this availability issue. So not having a car available and then having poor public transport. It's an accessibility, connectivity issue in as much as the transport does not connect where people want to go when they want to go there and may be irregular at different times of day. It's an affordability issue, even with the bus fare caps, and especially for those young people and so on who don't really even have an income. And it's a sort of acceptability issue, and that's more maybe what we're seeing with older people, is the issues around safety, comfort, the sort of length of the journeys, the journey experience. So it's those 4 A's. It's easy to remember then. So I'll shut up there.
And you've answered a few of our questions coming up. Katie.
Thank you. I know the Campaign for Better Transport and the CPRE published a report in 2020 about transport deserts. It didn't cover the southeast of England, but the concept is instantly recognisable in my patch of Kent's countryside. And if our experience is anything like that of others, the challenge compounds in rural areas where transport deserts often coincide with education deserts, which I have in Cranbrook, and healthcare deserts. I could go on. How do these areas develop, and what do you hear about how they affect daily life?
I can start. So the work we did on transport deserts that you mentioned, we based it around looking at small towns initially. So small towns of settlements between 5,000 and 30,000. And we defined a transport desert as existing where the choices and opportunities available to a community are limited by a lack of public transport. So we looked at 3 dimensions: whether there was a regular bus service or not, whether there was a regular train service and an open station, and whether there was access to other modes of transport, such as community-led transport or ferries, for example. And as you say, we didn't look at the southeast. We mainly concentrated on the southwest and the northeast, and we found that 56% of small towns were in a transport desert, and 2/3, 66%, had no train station. So there's a major issue there. I was quite interested to hear what the earlier panel said about a mixed picture more recently. In one area, the Chew Valley in North Somerset, for example, they had no bus service for a whole year, pretty much. The Metro Mayor, Dan Norris, did take an initiative to get some bus service improvement funding for that area, which now gives it about 6 buses a day or something like that, but you still need to change buses at least once to get to the major towns, and the level of service is still well below what was being provided before when the bus services were nationalised in Somerset.
And just to add to that, the places that were specifically poorly connected in the northeast included Northumberland, County Durham, and Dorset and Devon in the southwest. We subsequently did the left behind neighbourhoods analysis, which essentially identify those areas again in those regions, plus obviously we covered the rest of England as well. So that provides a much more sort of detailed picture as well. And the areas that we found in that analysis were clustered in coastal areas, like Tendring in Essex, former industrial towns, like in County Durham in the northeast, and small towns, as the transport deserts focused as well. Those areas are more reliant on buses, even though they have seen bigger declines in buses over time. So because of the sort of low levels of income, people are more reliant on buses, and they are still using buses more, despite service cuts. It is making connections worse to hospitals, to employment sites. So 34% of those left behind areas have longer travel times by public transport to the nearest hospital. It takes on average, twice as long. In terms of employment as well, people have lower levels of car ownership in those areas. Therefore, if the buses are being cut, then they are being further excluded from those opportunities.
Just a small piece of that in terms of how they develop over time, and there is a role there for government policy and decision making around investment priorities over the last 10 years and more, which is following the kind of where do we predict that we are going to need more capacity, and it's in cars, it's in the kind of road expansion, and it's making places more attractive to reach by car, and that as people then buy those cars because these places become more attractive, it undermines the viability of public transport that's then removed from these villages and towns, and people then increasingly move out of those villages and towns, as do services and other things, towards more urban areas. And so what we've seen more recently is a kind of more welcome shift towards, actually we don't really want that, we want to resolve these issues, we want more vision-led planning, and I think that's kind of the emphasis behind integrated national transport strategies, recognising we don't want to follow that same path anymore. We cannot get by just on predict and provide. We need to have a really clear sense of where we're going and how to reverse that tide.
Okay, I would agree. I was just going to quickly say that I think the point that was made earlier about the role of land use planning, because what I'm seeing in the rural area where I live is huge amounts of housing development. Some of it is for socially affordable housing, and the bus services are absolutely negligible if they're at all. So if you want to live in that area, you have to have a car, if not one, many. And so why are we building houses in places for people who can't afford cars, in places where there are no buses or train services? We have to put the two together.
Very good point. Okay, thank you. Steph.
Thank you. Yes, I think you've already all kind of implied that there's a correlation between transport poverty and economic inequality. If you have any other comments on that, I'd welcome them. But I wanted to ask you specifically about your views on a subset of economic inequality, which is those who are job seekers. Lack of reliable or even existent bus services, how do they affect job seekers in particular, please?
I can pick up an excellent study done a few years ago by Joseph Rowntree Foundation with the Sheffield Hallam, looking at the experience of job seekers, and explicitly found a kind of headline from that is that public transport was a barrier to accessing work. It was not enabling them to find work, and some of that's because it didn't take them where they needed to go, the kind of jobs that they were qualified to do or wanted to do, or well paid, and also it just simply wasn't reliable enough for them to get to the interviews, get to those places. So it is a barrier for those who are unemployed. And also, if you're in a low-paid job and you're looking for further work, where can you get to? But public transport provides a barrier to that as well.
Yeah, we did a study, but back in 2019, so we're talking about pre-COVID bus service levels, and 57% of job seekers were living in areas where they couldn't get to a centre of employment where there would be job opportunities within 45 minutes. Over half could not get in one way, so 90 minutes either way. The Department for Work and Pensions, their standard for being able to access a job and therefore be eligible to come off benefits is a 90-minute journey. So that's at that level, which is why we set it. And we realise that obviously is going to be huge. And it's not just that availability, but the cost of it as well. If you're job seeking, you've got to, you need the money to be able to get there, or if to take up a new job, you basically have to have the money up front. And there used to be schemes whereby there were benefits, there were free bus tickets, but local authorities, a lot of them just don't provide that anymore. So that you have to find that money from somewhere. And if you're already in a low-paid household, that's going to be difficult for a young person to find that money.
Would you go as far as to say that investing in public transport could reduce the welfare bill?
Absolutely. Just to add a point on unemployment, from our research on left behind neighbourhoods, we found that 24% of households in those areas were out of work and have no access to a car, and that was double the national average. So it just exacerbates that lack of opportunity. And the same goes for job centres. We had a case of a person who had to walk sort of several mile round trip to the nearest town to access a job centre just to sign on, because the bus service was cut. There's the impact on shift workers as well. I'm not sure if there's a separate question on that, but when it comes to industrial estates, people working shifts, that's a 24/7 operation, and it's difficult to provide an adequate bus service if that's in a rural area to sort of make a commercial sense. There are some large companies like Amazon who can subsidize shuttle buses to their depots, but that will be very rare. So we need to be thinking about, well, how are we addressing those job seekers and companies' needs to improve the economic prospects in those areas. And yes, if we can open up those opportunities, surely there will be a saving for the welfare bill in that respect.
Ollie?
I mean, some of what I'm going to ask you, you've touched on already, so feel free to just expand on what you've already said. But what do you feel are the main factors discouraging people from using bus services? I mean, cost presumably is a factor, as is reliability, route coverage, or do you think there's other significant challenges separate to those?
I'll read you a quote. So in the morning, it's like an interesting one, because I used to get the bus at 8:10, which is fine, but it's turned into a school service, so I can't get that bus at 8:10 now. Not that I don't want to, it's just that they won't stop for you. So my husband has to bring me to work early in the car, because I've got a little one, so he has to bring me to work at 7 o'clock. So she lost an hour with her kid in the morning. She's now car dependent because that one bus service has been changed, and she's lost that. And that's in the outskirts of Wigan, in a place called Hindley, which is not a rural area. You know. So and you can read loads of these things. You're waiting for 45 minutes. I can go there, but I can't get back. So I'm frightened to take the bus out because I don't know. Older people, just the reliability of the bus, waiting at a bus stop. All sorts of issues around safety, the journey length, that came up a lot, where people are saying, okay, I live in this area where it's an hour and a half for me to take the bus, not because the journey is so long, but because the bus stops all the time in the urban area, and then by the time I get to my peripheral area, so that sort of centre spoke, hub and spoke type design of bus services, which is largely around strategic corridors, which is largely what happened under trying to run profitable services rather than socially necessary ones. And I would almost say like all buses are socially necessary, actually, when it comes down to it.
Okay, thank you. You got the next question, Ollie, or was that been covered?
Yes, I mean, I think you've largely covered it.
Fine, right, no, that's fine. We'll move on then.
Yeah.
Katie.
Some students in rural areas, and actually some of the previous panellists touched on this, face really long bus commutes to access education. I've got some secondary school students who take an hour to get to their school, particularly in the morning when there's traffic, like you were just mentioning. What effects does this have?
I guess, I can speak to that. We have lots of quotes again from people and evidence that having poor bus connectivity can really disadvantage young people, especially people at an age where they want to be more independent, but they have to be reliant on their parents to either take them to school or to social activities. It means that they might not be able to access higher education as a result, so it can again diminish people's life opportunities. There's examples about bus services which are reduced during school holidays, so there might be a skeleton bus service during term time which becomes virtually non-existent during school holidays, which means that young people are either stuck at home or again reliant on parents. They miss out on social opportunities as well as life opportunities. So it can be really demoralizing. It means that where young people are then aspiring to be able to drive and afford a car for themselves. And then, as a result, we're losing a whole generation of potential future bus users, exactly at the time when we're trying to encourage more people to use buses.
So there's really good research done by Sustrans, University of Western England, on the experience of young people of the transport system that points to a general kind of much lower trip rates from 16 to 24-year-olds compared to the working age population, 25 to 64. And some of that relates to that when they are travelling, particularly in rural areas, they run out of time to do any more trips. They don't have access from those education opportunities to other cultural opportunities, kind of social opportunities and other things, kind of a real restriction on their independent mobility and kind of exactly at the moment as they're coming into young adulthood and looking for what they're going to be, and there's a real cost there to society and long-term cost to the economy, I would say, from that restriction.
But it's also not just young people, it's children as well. So children that have arduous bus journeys quite often will not end up turning up in school on time. They will be tired in the classroom. They will not have had time to have breakfast. Breakfast clubs are overwhelmingly populated by people who have to drop their kids off early because they're using public transport. All sorts of things around non-affordability of the bus fares means that kids don't turn up on a Friday because the week money has been spent and there's no more money for bus fares. Very interesting.
There's just one question that a colleague wanted to raise. I don't know if any of you know about the post-16 SEN transport. There's a gap in the law where it's not a requirement, it's effectively discretionary, and there's a mixed picture. Could any of you address that issue if you're aware of it?
So it's basically that they just don't qualify for all the way through for free transport. So in London, you don't think about it, right? All young people have free transport until the age of 25, as long as they're in education or apprenticeships. But it's not like that for the rest of the country. So there's a loophole whereby if you are not in education, training or some sort of an apprenticeship scheme, but nevertheless, I mean, nowadays it's in school until 18, but they basically don't qualify for that.
For young people with special educational needs. That apparently, for a lot of areas, that cuts off at 16.
It's 16, yeah, because that's the statutory requirement of the local authority provision. So they don't go to school anymore, so they don't get the fare allowance anymore, which again is really hugely awkward for them at a transitional period where they may be trying to go for independence and some supported living, and at that point they lose out. Okay. But after school activities as well, because they catch the school bus, there's nothing after the school and they can't participate in after school activities.
If I can make a very quick point about young people's concessions in general, there are vast discrepancies between different parts of the country, which is again disadvantaging people who are not entitled in those areas. So I think that there's a big case to be made about standardizing young people concessions. I know that's something the department is looking at as a follow-up to the cap expiring.
That's useful. Okay, thank you. Alex.
Turning to the issue of growth, something this government's particularly interested in, do you think that there's a link between poor bus connectivity and broader economic challenges like low productivity or growth, or flip it on its head? And is there a link between good bus connectivity and higher levels of growth?
I think you can definitely make that argument. And these things are always complicated when you're looking at kind of cause and effect on kind of local economies and declines of connectivity. But it's a simple point to say that kind of better connected labour markets, better connected local economies are going to be good for regional prosperity. And having seen the lack of investment made in transport connectivity, particularly around public transport in the north of England, you can see the discrepancy that exists between there and London and the south east. When colleagues of mine have looked at the gross value add, GVA, of the bus sector, you can track a decline from 2011 to 2023. The total decline is around 8.9 billion, kind of removed from the economy kind of over that period. But we calculate that kind of some of that has moved to other modes. So some of the people who would have been spending their money because they're coming in by bus to different areas may have moved to car. So the total shift we kind of say removed from GBA of buses is around 2 billion because of that. And that would make a big difference in many communities across the country. And I think any kind of next step, the integrated national transport strategy, and in thinking about how we allocate funding to buses in the future, could look at including an indicator around potential productivity in those places and how it aligns with local growth plans, which will be coming through in all those areas.
There is much evidence on the economic benefit of buses, particularly by CPT. So two quick points I would like to make is about value for money and investment in public transport, specifically buses, producing much higher returns on investment compared to, for example, roads investment. So for buses, it's £4.55 return for every pound spent, whereas for road investment, it can be as low as £1.10 or even negative value for money if we take the full externalities of road schemes. So it's a point for sort of prioritizing investment in public transport over expanding road capacity and generating additional congestion. Also, public transport reduces congestion and increases productivity, whereas, if you're stuck in traffic, obviously you're creating that cost to congestion and reducing productivity for the economy overall.
So controlling for all other sort of issues or externalities around land uses and likelihoods of employment and so forth. If you live in an area that's well served by public transport, there's a 10% less likelihood that you'll be unemployed.
Wow.
I mean, there are factors around people, where they live, where they choose to live, self-selection, of course, all of those things. But nevertheless, pretty much all things being equal, you're 10% more likely to be employed in an area with good public transport services. But it's not the whole picture, is it? That's the point.
Well, another quick point is that local buses help to spread growth rather than attract all investment to the centre of cities. They actually support local economies in the suburbs, in towns, where people can sort of make shorter local journeys and spend in their local economy instead.
And I guess you would just say that there is very good evidence of there being an economic impact of investment in buses. There is overwhelming evidence of its role in providing inclusive growth opportunities and access to employment for more people.
And I mean, you've been making the case for subsidised buses throughout the evidence you've been giving. Is there a price that you would put on that? I mean, what do you think is a reasonable per passenger journey subsidy? Because these journeys are being paid for by the taxpayer when it comes down to it. Would you want to put a figure on it at all, or a range?
And many of these journeys are delivering benefits to the taxpayer as well. I would say for those people who haven't then got in their cars and in the wider benefits that we've talked about from that. My colleagues are currently working on a report that will put a figure on the scale of investment that may be required in buses over the next few years, 5-year timeframes, as colleagues from earlier would welcome. So I'm not going to kind of preempt them with that working out. But the estimates vary greatly on the scale of investment required to get buses back to pre-COVID levels, or buses up to the level where they're carrying the number of passengers that would meet our environmental commitments. You could go from anything to double existing subsidies through to 7 times existing subsidies, depending on where you look.
But there's a difference, isn't there, between subsidising in a more remote area than a more connected area. And the price is going to be a great deal different, because fundamentally it's more spread out. The bus has to drive along further. And therefore, I was wondering if you thought that there was a specific sort of number that should go across sort of all different passengers.
I think in all of your considerations, what I've heard is you talking about buses, and there are just so many different times, situations of types of buses, of types of service for different people. So when you're trying to talk about subsidising young people to travel on buses, it's a completely different story to what you're talking about, old age pensioners not using their concessionary fare passes to travel on buses. The rural situation is completely different to the urban situation, the urban peripheral situation, where bus services are quite twilight and not in the sense where they're commercially viable. So you've actually not got you can't think of a one solution fits all type of how much you get. But there is an issue around what is the social value of that subsidy, and therefore, of course, not giving a subsidy that is above its social value. And there has been a lot of work done on the social value of bus services in different contexts by economists that know these things. And I think, therefore, that's a way that you would find to set the social value. But it would be different in rural areas versus urban areas for sure.
We did some further research to follow on the Transport Deserts work, which advocated an every village, every hour approach to rural bus networks, and we put a figure on that which we can write to the committee about if that would be helpful. I think a thing to add to that is that there's, even if you aren't necessarily able to implement or invest in an every village, every hour network, what you can look at is a number of changes just to make the network in rural areas more consistent in terms of the benefits it provides and how easy it is to navigate. So with the rail network, for example, the Great Western Railway, you could probably criticise them for higher fares, but what they have done with their rural rail services is that they've set much more consistent timetabling for a clock face, timetabling for services for places like Exeter to Barnstable, for example, which has massively increased train usage on that line because it's a much more reliable and consistent timetable. And what's also happened more recently is that they've connected the buses to further out towns like Bideford and Ilfracombe to that, again, on the same clock face principle. And that seems to have worked really well in terms of boosting usage. Similarly, you should also have a one-ticket approach as well, so it's much easier for people to be able to understand how much they're going to pay. And even regardless of what happens to the £3 fare cap in future, there's still a lot that can be learnt from the London example of having a single contactless approach or a single Oyster card. The West of England and Wiltshire have a one bus ticket option, but the Somerset County Council area has never had that. So that shows the very simple changes that could be made, which could actually benefit a lot of rural areas just by having the best practice being followed more consistently.
If I can add to your original question, Alex, I think, yes, there needs to be a reasonable level of subsidy sort of cut-off, and that would obviously depend on the area. It wouldn't make sense for a bus journey per passenger to cost as much as a taxi fare, which would obviously not be a very good level of use of public funding. But I think there needs to be a more sophisticated set of metrics being created to determine those allocations for funding and to determine what those, in effect, socially necessary services and reasonable level of service are. Things to take into account include population density, obviously different levels between urban, suburban and rural settings, car ownership levels, so that would be reflecting the potential demand for bus services in that area, demographics, again targeting those underserved demographics in specific areas, income employment levels, planned development and opening access to development and new growth areas as well, the level of revenue, as we mentioned, and the gaps into connectivity to specific destinations. I think all these things are sort of different metrics, I think, that need to be used in order when you define a minimum level of service guarantee, which is something that we've been the main proponents of. So it's not a sort of simple answer of, frequency or number of bus stops. It's about connecting to destinations from that sort of location. And I know that the Department for Transport and Treasury might be nervous about setting in legislation a service guarantee because of the revenue requirements that will be needed for that. But I think that it all goes back to sort of Campaign for Better Transport. We don't think that it's fair that it should be a postcode lottery of what bus services people have access to. It's a social justice issue, so it's about making sure that everyone has access to at least a minimum level of service that is reasonable to that location. And it's about plugging the gaps in places with inadequate provision. So such a measure will be very popular as well. We surveyed the general public, and 87% of people think that would be, they agree that every community needs to have at least a minimum level of service. And how it can work, it's about effectively making social and economically necessary services defined by guidance from the Department of Transport, so setting those metrics which I outlined, but then mapping and determining the reasonable level at the local level, as previous people on the previous panel commented. And then that would determine the level of need, which obviously the government has moved to needs-based funding allocations. That can be your main need metric to then target that investment of existing funding to places most in need.
Okay, thank you. Baggy.
Thank you. So research suggests that young people without the access to a car generally travel sort of 21% fewer trips on any mode of transport compared to the adults. And given what we've heard this morning, you know, it's obvious there's a generational aspect to transport inequality. So I'm not sure Karen or Stephen best placed to answer this, but you know, what are the practical things that can be done to address this?
What, in terms of young people's travel specifically? Well, people don't like young people on buses. They're rowdy, they're noisy, drivers go past them. There's a lot of issues around driver training and driver behaviour. It was interesting what was coming out of the skills sets that were there, because I do think that there's a lot of educational issues that could go on around young people contributing to the bus industry as well as using it, and maybe then they would value it more. We get a lot of really good stuff from young people with the youth parliaments that are coming in and telling us how to improve the services. A lot of the young people's institutes are coming in and sort of talking about their needs for buses. Basically, it is all this thing around out-of-hours services. It's around where people want to go, understanding better the links between a route and a destination. It seems crazy, but buses run where they don't really seem to be connected to the hospital or the town centre, or they stop too early for young people, but young people would like to see things happening. And of course, a lot of young people are employed, so the same sorts of issues, but they may be on low-paid employment. So I think there is definitely the cost thing comes up, that's the real big barrier. But it's also the young people will aspire to own cars because it gives them a sense of freedom. It gives them a sense of independence. They may be still at home. It may be the first thing that they do is want a car. And I think what we have to say is that you can improve the buses until you're blue in the face, but if you don't do anything to look at car restrictions and car operations and where cars are applicable and where they're not, then I think you really will be chasing your own tails. It is a whole, as they said before, it's a whole package deal. Buses on their own are a blunt instrument. It has to be thought of in terms of multimodal connectivity. This is like the flat fare. Are we going to talk about the fare at all? Because that flat fare is not affordable for lots of people.
Don't worry, it's coming.
and if it's a flat fare per journey, which it is in lots of places, you basically, every bus you get on, you pay. You get the bus and then the train, and it's £10 to get into Manchester from where I live. It's not cheap. So £3 is not an affordable amount for a lot of people. There and back, £6. So there's all of these things, and we've let the industry atrophy completely, and so the investment that's going to be needed is huge. And I think we have to bite that bullet and accept that there, you know, that even if we come in with these new franchises and so forth, it will be expensive. It will be, and that needs to be costed and then put, like Silviya says, in what's the social value? Where should we do that investment? Because we can't do everything. You won't be able to afford to do everything. It will be billions and billions and billions.
Anything to add, Stephen?
The only thing I would add, because that is a very comprehensive answer, is the role of the voice of young people in decision making, both at the national level and local level. The Integrated National Transport Strategy promises to be very people focused. Are we giving an appropriate space to young people and children in shaping what they want transport to look to them today and into the future as part of that? And I think that is a practical consideration that aligns with addressing barriers on cost and access and integration with other modes.
Yeah, and giving the people who really value the buses the voice is also something that's missing, I think. You hear a lot of voices from people who don't use the buses and then think something of them rather than the people who absolutely rely on them.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Catherine?
Continuing on social value, declining bus services can really impact upon access to health services, particularly for those who are disabled and on low incomes. So how do you think that we can address that?
Health services?
Access to health services by buses.
I guess lack of bus services can really make it harder for people to attend medical appointments, particularly for people with disabilities or those on low income. So how transport challenges affect health outcomes is really important to look at as a system. So public transport is fundamental to enabling access to healthcare services, especially given the amount of missed appointments that there are here. There's 7.8 million appointments missed every year. Approximately 10% of those are estimated to be due to travel requirements. There's research that about 2/3 of people can't reach their nearest hospital by public transport within 30 minutes. So it's quite a significant amount. If you don't have a car, it's very difficult for people. So, again, our research showed that on average, people must travel 2 kilometers further to their nearest A&E if they live in a left-behind neighbourhood, as I explained before, in areas that are already deprived. But also improving public transport and walking and cycling around hospitals can really improve people's health, so it can be a positive contributor in addition to improving access to health services and improving health in that way. Physical activity, reduced air pollution through greater use of public transport and active travel, they all impact on people's health and can create savings for the NHS. If we are to invest in public transport, there's issues such as obesity, diabetes that have huge costs to the NHS that can be tackled through better investment in active travel and public transport. There's statistics that if everyone switched 2 car journeys to bus a month, that would result in 14.9 billion worth of cumulative health benefits. It's huge amounts that we need to be including those wider benefits in the assessment of our investment in public transport. Just one more point to make is that if we have better coordination between local transport services, NHS trusts are responsible for non-emergency patient transport. They have separate budgets. They're frequently commissioned without coordination with other local transport providers, such as bus operators, such as community transport or tendered local authority services. If we were to sort of work together with pooling budgets, that would create efficiencies, it would create budget savings. So as well as unlocking travel for patients, we're also benefiting visitors and the wider community if we're using those funds better.
Thank you, that's really helpful. What role do you think that poor bus connectivity plays in the context of mental health?
I guess public transport has many proven benefits for mental health, and poor transport can really contribute to social isolation, to loneliness. People who are cut off from seeing their friends and family or leisure activities, that really contributes to that feeling of isolation. There's statistics that show that about 18% of adults feel lonely most of the time. So it's a huge problem. But if you think about the bus, you sort of get on, you chat to the driver, you chat to your fellow passengers. It really opens up a community connection for people. So huge benefits, I would say.
It's a two-edged sword. It's a land use issue as well. Hospitals chose to locate on the outskirts of cities where it's not that easy to serve by bus. There's no requirement that buses serve hospitals at all. So when you think about what First Bus was saying about the profitability issue, if it's not a profitable route, it might be essential for people who want to get there, but it might not be. And hospital appointments are at all different times of the day and night. You've got workers there, shift workers, nurses, and basically the services that are going back and forth to hospitals are not regular enough, maybe not even there at all. So you've got health centres that are not even connected to the bus services, clinics. So there's been this drive from the health perspective, the same as what's happened with colleges, that the land uses have dispersed, And it's much, much more difficult to develop a sort of reasonable, dense network at an affordable level. So the bus operators, I think, have done the best that they can with changing land uses. But while there's no statutory requirement to guarantee that people do have a bus service to go to A, B, C and D, you've obviously got a problem. So 2019, 66% of older people over the age of 65 could not get to hospital within 35 minutes by public transport. Right, 35 minutes is a reasonably long journey. So they got the free bus fare, they got the free bus pass, they can't use the bus. All sorts of issues around that. So that's what I'm saying, it's a blunt instrument. You can't hope for the buses to do everything. You've got to have that coordinated approach that other things, especially the planning and land use, are connected with that as well, the service provision.
Talk about a couple of different groups, but are there specific demographics that you would say are disproportionately affected by poor bus connectivity?
Anything that hasn't been already said?
I think we covered young people, older people as well. Women is the only one to point out. So we have been working with Unison on a report on social carers, and particularly home carers who deliver in-home care to patients. They need to travel long distances and from between different points across the day, and that has made them heavily reliant on personal vehicles. Because buses are frequently inadequate, they cannot cover that sort of whole range of journeys that they need to make. But care workers, they're undervalued, they're overworked, they're on low paid, so they can barely afford to keep a personal private vehicle. That's why I think it's really important to make sure that we consider the needs of people on low income and the people that they care for as well. They provide a vital service, but they're really disadvantaged by poor bus services.
Anyone else that wanted to comment on what needs to change and looking at the gaps in policy to be able to make sure that we're not disproportionately impacting upon women when it comes to cuts to bus services?
I think we really need to look at concessionary fares across the board. So I think the concessionary fare bill is huge. There are people who are not using their bus passes. So obviously they're not costing us anything, but nevertheless it's sort of like seen that the older population is poor, is in need of subsidy. And it is in certain circumstances, but it isn't always. And so I think, but then younger people who've got no money or people on very low wages are not eligible for any concessionary fares or half-price fares. Even some children don't get half-price fares going to school, you know, under 16. So I think we really have to look at the whole fare structure and really, really think about where do we want to spend those millions of pounds in terms of subsidy every year, in terms of the fare, the propping up the fare costs, because there are definitely groups of people that are travelling on buses for free that don't need to, without a doubt. Elderly, still in work, over 60s, you know, still working on big incomes, and they've got free bus pass and they use it. So I think we really have to think about what are those subsidies for? Are they for getting people that are poor onto to allow them to travel, or are they something else which is about shifting people out of their cars and trying to encourage them to use? They're not the two same things. So subsidising the poor is not the same as trying to get people out of their cars onto buses. It's not the same policy.
Was that a question specifically about women, wasn't it? Kind of how to improve services for them. And I think the two sides to that, lots covered there. One was around kind of what journeys are we designing bus services to support? Are they the standard A to B commuter trips that often men are making because of the disproportionate kind of burden of care on women within society? Or are they local trips that support kind of trip chaining and getting between different destinations in more local areas? And then the other really important aspect, which I think this government is really focusing on, is social safety side of that. Do you feel safe from your doorstep to your destination and back using active travel and public transport or not? And what role can the bus play in making people feel safer on the bus? But also, as we're seeing piloted kind of around the country, kind of bus drivers' role in maybe stopping to help women who they see in distress on the street, that side of things as well. There's a real kind of like public service aspect to that, I think, which is important to consider.
I think in addition to those points, in rural areas there are also often particular challenges about the state of rural roads, in that in that many rural roads have very high speed limits, for example, and it can often feel incredibly unsafe to wait for a bus on a typical A or B road in a deep rural area.
Or to cycle as an alternative.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
On the question of policy levers, I think we've already covered fares and sort of concessions. I would add simpler fares to that, so simpler fare structure. That was one of the benefits of the fare cap, that you had no question about different prices for different lengths of trips. Two areas I would like to cover is funding allocations and then statutory requirements on local authorities. In terms of funding allocations, previously they tended to be competitive, which created winners and losers among local authorities. We heard examples in the previous sessions. Analysis we've conducted shows that prior to the most recent round of BSIP funding, there were 10 councils that received over £50 per head in terms of bus funding, and 14 councils that received less than £6 per head. So huge variations, and authorities that did receive good levels of funding have managed to, deliver transformations that have boosted bus usage. There are many examples, I'm sure, in the submissions. But authorities that didn't have adequate funding have managed to do very little. And I think that's been a big issue. There has been, little transparency in terms of the factors and the formulas used for the allocations. But I think the movement to need-based allocations has been positive. But again, if I understand correctly, the factors used in that are existing vehicle mileage, levels of deprivation and population. I think the factors and the allocations formula need to be more transparent but also more sophisticated, referring to the factors which I related earlier. In terms of requirements on local authorities, with socially necessary services, in the national bus strategy there was a promise of new guidance that would define those services, which hasn't come. And also there was mention of possibly introducing a statutory requirement for councils to deliver that if the BSIP funding is not managing to deliver socially necessary services. Again, there is a gap in this. The bus services bill that was introduced in December only proposes requiring local authorities to identify existing services which are socially necessary and safeguarding those if there's a threat to their cut. But I think this is not enough. There also needs to be a requirement to map the gaps in provision. So which are the socially and economically necessary services that are not currently there? So what are the existing gaps in provision? And again, that goes back to my argument for defining that socially necessary level, a minimum level of service, and then delivering that through more sophisticated allocation of funding. Ideally, you would want the Department for Transport to be determining those factors that local authorities need to use. Currently, local authorities are required to deliver bus connectivity assessments, but there hasn't been a consistent guidance on the data that they need to use, so it hasn't been very comparative. I think there needs to be more work done on this, and then targeting the funding to deliver and fill those gaps.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I also just point out the difference between the capital funding that they're getting and the revenue? And a lot of what we're talking about is about running services. It's not about having new buses or bits of pavement. I'm not saying that those things aren't important, or guided busways or whatever it happens to be, or electric vehicles. It's about actually a lack of services and a lack of service provision, and that tends to be more of a revenue issue. This driver shortage thing is an issue around pay, but also work conditions because of the long hours. There's definitely where they've sort of looked at the way in which contracts are for workers. A lot more women have come in as bus drivers when they thought more about flexible type contracts, and that has helped with that, like part-time jobs and so on, but that doesn't pay very well. So just those two things.
Thank you. And thank you for all your contributions. I suppose I wanted to ask a kind of magic wand question, but I'll put some context around it. Magic wand question would be, how would you see resources allocated by government or local councils to improving bus services? We've heard a lot about the problems or the negative impact of poor services, a little bit about funding, the quantum. Silviya, you talked about how it should be directed based on need. I suppose the other question lingering in my mind as you think about this magic wand question of how you would direct services if you could just wave a magic wand, how would you direct resource allocation if you could wave a magic wand, is, for instance, this is all very complicated. Do we need radical simplification of the way this is thought about? Do we need a different model? Do environmentalists like me need to get off the opinion that buses should be taking us from the start of our journey and instead think about car usage as a viable rural option to get us to a bus stop, for instance? Like, what other changes that we haven't talked about would you like to see considered?
If I can build on my previous answer, I think it's about identifying that level of need and having a better measure of need to use in funding allocations. Also, I guess we need to be honest that if you want to see transformational sort of level of improvements, London-style services, as the government promised to the rest of the country, you would need additional funding. But I don't think we've done the analysis about what that is, and it doesn't have to be as much as some people would, I think. So we have been doing some gap analysis with one of the leading companies involved in the bus connectivity assessments. It's early stages, so we will be developing it in more detail. But our analysis suggests that it's 139 wards across England out of 7,600 that have severe gaps. So a relatively small percentage, and another 2,864 requires some enhancements. So if you're thinking about density of bus services and also connectivity to key destinations, this is something that needs to be mapped at the local level, and I think that's what is required. But we estimate that it would cost under 1 billion a year to deliver those improvements in those wards of additional funding. But then you need to consider that that amount would reduce as bus use increases. So when you provide services, you attract more passengers, so the revenue demand will decline over time. And I mentioned earlier better coordination with other local services. So again, you can achieve efficiencies and budget savings. Franchising would help with that. So if you're planning a network, together, you can obviously cross-subsidize. We talk about the dichotomy between commercial provision and supported provision. If we can integrate that in franchising areas, that is a big benefit. But what about areas that won't franchise? We need to think about those as well.
Okay. And I would add to that contracted community transport services, so that actually definitely in rural areas they're not volunteer services, they're actually properly contracted and open to everybody and able to pay for them as well on demand. I think there is a role for taxis as well, and thinking about that, shared taxis, the role of mass, particularly in rural areas. Its potential is there, but it's never really been rolled out around bike hubs, around stations and so on and so forth. So I think there is that element there for your environmentalist. Yeah. But I do think that the environmental agenda is not the same as the social agenda, and you're talking about different audiences with different needs, different demands, and so the buses come into both of those things, but they're not necessarily the same thing. That's what I said to you before. It's like you can't hit everything with the same hammer. You've got to come up with, that's for the environment, that's your CO2 net zero policy, that's where the buses fit in there, and here's where they do the social exclusion thing. And sometimes that might come together.
One can support the other, of course.
They can, but they might not always, and you have to sort of think that. But I do agree, this analytical thing around thinking about what do we have now, what don't we have, and then where do we best direct the resources that we have available. And I think that will be mostly concentrated not actually in rural areas or dense urban areas, but around the urban periphery where there is large populations reliant on public transport that is inadequate. Because if what you're doing is hourly bus services to the countryside and they're running around empty, which is what happened last time we had a benchmark for hourly rural bus services, it wasn't a good policy. It didn't work.
Okay, we've still got a couple more questions, and time is really pressing. Just as Karen, you've touched on demand-responsive transport. Have any of you got anything? And any of the other three of you got anything to add on DRT, or do you want to send us some stuff?
There are examples in our submission.
Sorry?
There are some positive examples in our submission I can refer back to. I guess it depends on, they have been pluses and minuses. They work in some areas. It depends on how they're set up.
Passenger subsidies are higher.
I would say not directly on DRT, but certainly a bit more that could add to Steph's original question of the magic wand and where we're trying to get to. But I appreciate if there's not time, I leave on them.
Okay, thank you. Right, Ollie, did you just want to touch on?
Well, just very briefly, because I'm very conscious of time, as you say, Chair. But we touched a little bit on the increase of the bus fare cap from £2 to £3. I mean, does any Professor Lucas, you were very clear about that you thought that was a negative policy change. Do any other members of the panel have any thoughts as to the impact of that increase in the bus fare cap?
Well, I think what we found from the evaluation of the bus fare cap when it's at £2, which is limited data, I think it only looked at 2023, is on policy terms, it did what it set out to do. It reduced transport costs, particularly for those on the very lowest incomes. It would be great to have an intervention that looked and did the same into the future. Our view kind of within IPPR was that we would have liked to have seen the bus fare cap stay at a lower level for this year and then be probably more defined at a local level in the future once we've resolved some of these big questions about long-term funding and bus reforms and where this fits alongside devolution. Some of these decisions are better taken at that local level. I'm being wrapped up.
I think from our perspective, we'd be prepared to be flexible about what kind of ticketing system you have in the future, but I think it's important to bear in mind the overall picture, which is that the costs of taking the bus overall have grown considerably greater for individual passengers since the system was privatised. And again, if you compare the costs of taking a bus in this country to many other countries, and again, even in London, it's much, much higher. But there are a number of flexible things that can be looked at. For example, I think, again, if you look at the West of England Combined Authority, they've got a single combined bus and train ticket for that area. And they also have single bus tickets as well, which are cheaper than the single bus and train tickets. And that can actually save on the £2 bus fare if you use the bus or train more than 3 or 4 times in a day, for example. So there are a number of solutions that could be looked at on that, I think.
Two very quick things to add is that in rural areas, £3 can still be very good value compared to prices that might have been before. But in urban areas, it has been a significant increase, and I know that it has priced some people off using buses. The other point was about simplicity. Some places have gone back to point-to-point pricing, and that really is putting some people off. It's really making things more complicated rather than just tap and go. So two factors that need to be considered about what follows it.
Thank you. I just have one follow-up question. We talked about bus connectivity and economic growth. Have any of you done any specific work on the link between the health of, or otherwise, of high streets and bus connectivity?
I actually did try to find some quantifiable examples ahead of the session. I think because of the bus service improvement interventions being quite recent, it's really hard to find specific examples. But I guess another point to make is that, when it opens up opportunity to the local economies, the local high streets, it's leisure and hospitality that also need to sort of thrive, and having poor weekend and evening services really disadvantages those sectors.
I think there's also an additional point to bear in mind about making tourism more sustainable as well. And again, if you have a good bus network in rural areas that are particularly attracted to tourism, then that can actually massively reduce the number of cars on the road. If you look, for example, at the South Downs, for example, the service that goes between Brighton and Eastbourne has been hugely popular, and it brings a huge number of people into the national park who wouldn't otherwise get there. And Chew Valley, that I mentioned earlier, is potentially a very attractive area for tourism, but as I said, in 2023-24, it had no bus service at all for about 12 months.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think we've all found that to be a really valuable pair of sessions, and I'd like to thank all today's witnesses. And if there's any evidence you think we haven't covered, please do send it to us as we progress our inquiry. That concludes today's meeting. Order.